Good evening and welcome back to Studio One. For this session with us, we have Sarah Ward in conversation with the award-winning British crime writer Martin Edwards in yours truly, Martin Edwards. Martin Edwards is a British crime novelist and a winner of several eminent awards. He's a 2020 recipient of the CWA Diamond Dagger for the sustained excellence of his work. He's also won the Edgar, Agatha, HRF Keating and McCavity Awards, the CWA Short Story Dagger and Dagger in the Library, and the Poirot Award for his contribution to the genre. Sarah Ward. Sarah Ward is the author of the 4 DC Childs novels set in the Derbyshire Peak District where she lives, and a gothic thriller, The Quickening, written as Rhiannon Ward. Was
Sustained excellence is the term that describes the ingenious work of the unparalleled crime novelist Martin Edwards. Martin Edwards is a British novelist, crime fiction critic, and historian. Edwards is the latest recipient of the Crime Writers Association's Diamond Dagger, the highest honor in the UK for crime writing. The honor was bestowed upon him in recognition of his continued, sustained excellence and his significant contribution to the world of crime writing in the English language. Edwards has authored 19 novels, with Mortmain Hall and Gallows Court being the latest. He is also the recipient of multiple prestigious awards and honors, such as the Edgar, Agatha, HRF Keating and Poirot Awards, 2 McCavity Awards, the CWA Marjorie Allingham Short Story Prize, the CWA Short Story Dagger, and the CWA Dagger in the Library. Edwards is highly admired by his peers, with the literary world appreciating his imagination and flair for crime writing. His specialty is marrying people and places to plot, a quality that has been lauded time and again. Edwards has also conceived and edited How Done It, a masterclass in crime writing by members of the Detection Club, ranging from Ian Rankin to John le Carré. He was nominated for the CWA Gold Daggers and once for the Historical Dagger, along with being shortlisted for the Theakston's Prize for Best Crime Novel of the Year for The Coffin Trail. He is consultant to the British Library's Crime Classics series and a former chair of the Crime Writers Association. He became the president of the Detection Club in 2015, succeeding predecessors such as G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Agatha Christie over the past 90 years. His novels include the Harry Devlin series and the Lake District Mysteries, 9 non-fiction books, and 70 short stories. Edwards has also edited more than 40 anthologies of crime writing that went on to yield many award-winning stories. PILF is honored to welcome Martin Edwards.
Hello, Martin. Thanks for joining me today. I'm delighted to be talking to you about your lengthy and illustrious career in rainy England at the moment.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone at the festival for inviting me and for organising this wonderful event in such testing times. I only wish I could be there in person, but this is a wonderful substitute.
Yes, it seems to be going really well. I caught up with one of the panels yesterday and it looked very good. We're going to be talking today about your lengthy career across the crime fiction genre, fiction, non-fiction, short stories. But I thought we could start by going back to how it all began. Most writers have a sort of moment when they read a book or they discover an author and think, this is what I want to do. You're obviously an expert in the golden age of crime fiction, classic crime, but was there a moment where you discovered crime fiction?
Oh, there was, and I think I'm unusual, at least in the fact that I can identify the very day that I conceived this interest. It was the 4th of July, many years ago, back in the 60s. I was 8 years old, and I discovered Agatha Christie. And the first book I read was The Murder at the Vicarage. I absolutely fell in love with the idea of the detective story, the puzzle, the plot, the red herrings, the surprise solution at the end, the final twists. And really from that moment on, Sarah, two things happened. First of all, I developed this passion for reading crime stories. And secondly, I wanted to tell those stories myself in addition. So the two things went hand in hand, and they still do.
So Murder in the Vicarage, that's Miss Marple, isn't it? So
yes, it
are you Miss Marple or are you a Hercule Poirot fan?
Well, I began with Miss Marple, but I think in terms of the plots, the storylines, the Poirots tend to be stronger. But Miss Marple is a wonderful character because, of course, the concept is so brilliant. This little old lady who lives in this quiet, pleasant, charming English village. But she understands human nature. She understands the nature of evil. She draws these parallels between the incidents in the village and the murder mysteries that she encounters. And that's a brilliant concept, I think, that has really stood the test of time.
It has, and it's interesting how popular she is in as much as it hasn't really been copied. I know they had Miss Silver back in the day, but it's not a theme that crime writers have picked up really. How is it, the sort of elderly detective who's using their life experiences to solve crimes, really?
Yes, well, some people have tried, but of course the great thing about Agatha Christie, I think, is that she had a deceptively simple style of writing. She was a very intelligent writer, and she was able to capture universal types of behaviour. So although there isn't the in-depth psychological study of characters, you can recognise the types, and you can recognise them wherever you are in the world, because human nature is rather similar throughout the world. The vices and the flaws and the sins and everything, in particular, and so it's this universality, I think, that is unique in Christie that many others have tried to emulate, but is very hard to achieve.
It is. So you discovered Agatha Christie as a child, about 8 years old, and obviously you're an expert in classic crime, the golden age of crime fiction. Did you discover other authors at that time as well, in your teens and so on, the classic crime writers?
Well, yes, I read literally every Agatha Christie I could get my hand on. I was the youngest member of the public library, the adult section. I migrated to the adult section, and the librarians are very kind to me. I've never forgotten that, at the local library. So I read all of Agatha Christie, quite literally, everything she'd written. And then I moved on to Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, people like that. And then I started reading the writers who were then contemporary, writers like Michael Gilbert and Julian Simmons. And I came across them when I was 13, 14, 15, and so I broadened my approach to what was then the cutting edge of British crime fiction, and then the Americans as well. So I started with the Golden Age and Christie, but I moved beyond that whilst retaining my love of the Golden Age at the same time.
So you were doing huge amounts of reading. Were you actually doing any writing as a teenager?
Well, I was. I still have the little books. I wrote a series when I was 10 called Melvin Hughes, strangely never published, but they're shameless rip-offs of Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes, really. And I wrote a number of those books. And I think the first one was 70 handwritten pages, so it's quite long for a 10-year-old. So I was very keen, but then as I got a little bit older, as a teenager, I became a bit more inhibited about the idea of plot and where to get your ideas from, all that kind of thing. So I slowed down and became a bit more shy about my writing as I got a bit older, for a few years at any rate.
I'll ask you a bit more about your writing process a bit later on, but just pick up, you hand wrote your first books. Do you handwrite now? I spoke to a writer recently, and she handwrites all her first drafts, or have you been using it?
Yeah, well, what happened was that after I left university, my parents had encouraged me to study law because they were very nervous about my ambition to become a crime writer. Quite rightly, they thought it was a pretty tough game, and they're absolutely right. So they persuaded me to get a proper job whilst I wrote, and encouraged me to study law. I did so. I got my law degree, and I trained as a solicitor in Leeds. I had no money in those days, so I couldn't go out. So I decided to write a book, a crime novel. I wrote a thriller. I wrote it in longhand, and I then mentioned it to some of the girls at work, and one of the secretaries agreed to type it for me at an hourly rate. But unfortunately, she was a very slow typist, so I ran out of money, and the book was probably, thankfully, never typed all the way through. So after that, I taught myself to touch type.
Right.
And that was quite a breakthrough. And ever since then, I've typed all my own books.
So you began your career on a typewriter.
Yeah, that's right. I taught myself whilst I was still training to be a solicitor, because I thought, well, I can't afford to pay a typist to type it for me, so I need to do it myself, because I really was very committed to this idea. Even though I'd realised by then it was a hard thing to achieve.
So you were in Liverpool, you were working as a solicitor. How did the idea of the Harry Devlin novels come to you? I mean, did it make sense that you were working as a solicitor to have a sort of lawyer as a main protagonist? And how much of yourself did you put in those early books?
Well, I started by getting legal articles and then legal books published when I was in my mid-20s. So I got the experience of being a published writer early on and meeting deadlines and that kind of thing. That's helped with my non-fiction in the crime field as well. That background experience and dealing with publishers is always valuable to know the ins and outs of the business. But I did have this burning ambition to write crime, and not to write just one book, but to write a series. And so on the idea of write what you know, I didn't know any police officers at that time. I didn't know any private eyes. So I thought I'd write about a lawyer. So I created this character, Harry Devlin. I thought Liverpool, where I was working at that time, was a great setting, very atmospheric city, a city I love very dearly. And I thought it would be a good place to set a series. And so that was really the genesis of the Harry Devlin series, and the first book, which was called All the Lonely People, which of course is a line from the Beatles song Eleanor Rigby.
And how much of yourself did you put into the character?
Well, I put in some of my own interests. So he likes crime fiction, he likes football, he likes cricket, he likes films. But I took great care to ensure that his life was very different from mine, and his working life was very different from mine. So he's a criminal lawyer, a divorce lawyer, areas of law I've never dealt with in my life. I've always been an employment or commercial lawyer. And the firm he worked in was pretty down at heel. But he was a native-born Liverpudlian, a Scouser, which I'm not. I come from Cheshire, which is not too far away, but not quite the same as Liverpool. So there were many differences. Thank goodness, because he has a very, very troubled life. But he's somebody I've always enjoyed writing about. And I like the humour of the books, and maybe one day I will go back to Harry, see how he's getting on.
Oh, that would be good. Because you'd spent ages, obviously, trying to be published, as in you'd been writing and so on. How did it feel to see your first book in print, have it in your hand?
Well, it was a long journey from the 4th of July back in 1964.
Yeah.
My first novel actually came out in 1991, so I was 35, but it felt like a very, very long time. So of course, the news that I'd had a novel, except I'd finally achieved this lifelong ambition, was very exciting indeed. And that first book did well. It was nominated for the Creasy Award, the Creasy Dagger, and it lost out but it lost out to Walter Mosley, who's a literary superstar. So that wasn't too bad. So it was a good start, and I was lucky with that. So of course, once I'd achieved that goal that I dreamed of
Yeah.
as a small boy, there was really no stopping me after that.
After your that particular series, you've written other books, but you're also the author of a successful series set in the Lake District, which began with the Coffin Trail. Can you tell us a little bit about the gestation of that series, and how was it setting a crime series in a rural location as opposed to the very urban setting of Liverpool?
Well, I've always wanted to improve as a writer, to stretch my talents and not be satisfied. I'm proud of the books that I've written, certainly, but you always want to do better and to see what you're capable of. So I want to write different things. So I decided to move away from Harry Devlin. I wrote a book I was very, very keen on called Take My Breath Away, which I thought was going to be my big breakthrough, and it wasn't really. But it was significant. It was a psychological thriller set in London, and it was brought by a young editor called David Shelley, very, very good editor indeed. And he took me to his publishing house, and he said to me that he'd like to publish a series of mine, but he wanted something fresh, and he thought that it would be good for me to try a rural background.
Okay.
So it was David's idea. And I went away, thought about it after having written 8 books with an urban background, and I thought, where would I like to go to research? The Lake District. It's not too far away from where I live, so I pitched the idea of the Lake District, a series, and again a series with a kind of arc. The idea of the Harry Devlin series was twofold. The stories, the individual books combined the gritty Liverpool setting with Golden Age style plots. Not that in those days anybody ever mentioned the Golden Age plot, but there was also the idea of the way that Liverpool was developing as a city and coming out of a very dark period of its history. With the Lake District, it was something different. It was about how English rural society is coping with the pressures of life in the 21st century. So that was in the background, but in the foreground was the relationship between the cold case detective, Hannah Scarlett, and a historian called Daniel Kind. And I pitched to David Shelley the idea of the first book, The Coffin Trail, and he liked it and commissioned it and published it. And that was a book that did very well for me. So I've carried on with that series intermittently ever since.
Do you think you're naturally a series writer as opposed to a standalone novel writer? Because certainly that's the vast majority of your career, isn't it? The various series novels.
It is, and as I mentioned earlier, I'd always had this ambition to write a series, but I do also like writing standalones. I think the answer to the question is it really depends on the nature of the story idea for me. Some story ideas are short story ideas. Some ideas are standalone novel ideas, and some fit in with the context of a series. So it really depends on the nature of the idea that seizes my imagination at any one particular kind, rather than a particular preference for one form or another.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your writing process. I'll just ask you a couple of questions, which sort of tends to define writers. Would you see yourself as a plotter, or do you just sort of get going and see where the muse takes you?
Well, predominantly over the years, I've always been a plotter, and the first book was very extensively outlined in advance with chapter notes and character biographies. But of course, as you know, Sarah, as a novelist, the more that one works at it, the more experience you get, and the more practiced you become, the more confident you get, your morale it improves gradually, and so you feel you can take more risks. So I've tended to plot in advance less and less over the years. So the Lake District books, I will begin with an idea for an interesting psychological motive for the murder. So I know that, but I don't know how the detective is going to reach the solution. I don't know what's going to happen along the way. And then with Gallows Court, that began quite differently. At that point in my career, I was again wanting to do something very different, wanting to try to raise my game a little bit further. And I had the idea of a character, the character who became Rachel Savanack. And the idea was of a young woman with a mysterious past who arrives in London. She's fabulously rich. It's evident that she's extremely ruthless. She's got a small entourage of devoted servants, but they're not servants, they're collaborators. And she gets involved in bizarre murder mysteries. And that idea really captured my imagination. And I wanted to write a book about her, but I knew it would be a difficult undertaking. So I actually wrote a short story about Rachel, just as an experiment to see whether I enjoyed writing that. And not a story to be sold, to be published, but as a practice run, if you like, a pilot, so to speak. So I found I did enjoy writing about her. And so that was a book that I began with no idea how it was going to resolve itself. And as a result, of course, it took me about 3 years to write it and rewrite it and rewrite it.
It does take longer.
And no contract or anything like that. So it was a big gamble. It was a complete departure from what I'd written previously in every way. It's set in 1930. It had a single lead female character, although there is a male character, Jacob Flint, the journalist, who became more important as I wrote it. So it was a break from what I'd been doing, but I felt ready to try to go for it and see what happened. I didn't know if it would be taken by a publisher, but luckily it went down well, and so I got a deal for 2 books. So what might have been a standalone turned out to be the start of what I hope will be an ongoing series.
And how much different did you find it writing a historical novel? Did you have to do an awful lot of research, or all these golden age books you'd read, had they sort of filtered into you? And I'm just interested about the research. Really, did you find non-fiction more helpful for research, or actually reading novels of the decade to pick up some things about the environment and so on?
Yes, I think I've just started the 3rd book in the series, actually, and I've been doing quite a lot of research on specifics. It's certainly helpful to have read a lot of Golden Age books. I continue to read them voraciously, and that definitely helps. But of course, there are specific things that you want to research for every story that you want to try and get right if you possibly can. And so I do quite a lot of specific research, which may turn out just to be a couple of lines in the story, but I want to try to get it right. And I do find, as I'm sure you do in your writing career, that people are very helpful when you contact them and ask them for guidance. So I contacted somebody the other day to ask him about a particular pub in London, and he gave me all sorts of historical detail, which is really, really helpful for one particular scene in the new book. So I do that research and try to create the impression, even though I'm writing in the 21st century, and that I think inevitably comes across in the style of the fiction. I want to try to get that element of verisimilitude into the novel as well, if possible.
A lot of writers sometimes put sort of tropes in their books or individual bits of humour to sort of. Have you put any golden age tropes for the sort of golden age fans that they might recognise in your books?
Oh yes, there are certainly quite a number. First of all, in Gallows Court, and then in the second book, Mortmain Hall, which came out earlier this year. That is a book that features the same characters, Rachel and Jacob, but it's written differently. That is much more of an elaborate puzzle, and there's more humour in it as well, quite a lot more humour. Gallows Court is a very dark book, Although it's also, I like to think, of ripping yarn. But Mortmain Hall is an intricate storyline. And what I included at the end of that book was something that used to be quite popular in the 1920s and 1930s, but it's not been seen the last 50, 60 years at least, and that's a clue finder. So right at the end of the book, there's a list of clues, in fact 34 clues, with references in the text to where the clues are. And of course one hopes that the clues are so cunningly disguised that the general reader won't pick them all up, but it's a little game that you play in the way that Golden Age writers used to play the game with their readers. But it's that challenge to the reader: can you solve the mystery before all is revealed at the end of the novel?
I think that was one of the biggest surprises for me when I got published, that readers still read books to look for the clues. I really hadn't realised that at all.
Yes, it's different readers. Some just read for the story, but some like to try to solve it, and one tries to appeal to both of them.
Exactly. Going back to the writing process, do you write in a linear way? Do you start at the beginning and keep going, or do you sort of move around the book and bring it all together at the end?
I generally do, although I think with the book I've recently started that there may be a subplot, a strand that I add in little sections at a later stage, but I'm not ready to do that yet. But essentially, I write in a linear way with the occasional exception.
And most writers can be split into those who love the first draft but hate editing, or they hate the first draft but they love editing. Which one would you? Which camp are you in?
Oh, I hate the first draft always, and I very often hate the fifth draft and the seventh draft. I revise endlessly, and I'd revise all my previous books if I got a chance, really, because as I said earlier, I think one never stops having ideas, or never stops wanting to improve. There are always things you can do better, and so there is that streak in me that always wants to change things around a bit and try something else. So I like revising a book and making it better. I once completed a book written by somebody else, a Scottish writer called Bill Knox, who died before finishing his novel. It's a book called The Lazarus Widow. I was commissioned to complete it, and I read the manuscript. It was very impressive, very polished, far better than anything I ever write as a first draft. And so I asked the publisher what the solution was. They had no idea, and his widow had no idea.
Okay.
It turned out that Bill just made it up as he went along, so I had to solve his mystery in order to finish his book. So different writers have different methods.
Yeah, of course. As well as your longer fiction, you're a prolific short story writer with over, 60 published stories, and you also edit various anthologies and have done it for the Crime Writers Association and other organisations. Why are short stories so popular in the crime genre, given that you often need quite a big space to explain a crime and solve it? And is the process of writing them different to writing a novel?
I think it is a different process. It's more intense. I think with a novel you've got space. You've also got a time. Even with a deadline, it takes quite a while to write a novel. It typically takes me a year, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. And in the course of a year, you'll have more ideas as you go along, almost inevitably. With a short story, there tends to be generally one central idea that drives it. It might be a setting, it might be a plot twist, it might be something to do with character. So it's a more concentrated piece of work, and that does appeal to me greatly. This is why I've always loved reading short stories and writing them. And yeah, if I get an idea, for instance, a little mystery based around the index to a book, I wrote a story based on that idea called An Index. It was a mystery story. I wrote a story which was based on those acknowledgements that you see in books where the author thanks people. And so the short story begins with the author thanking people, but it turns out to be a murder story. It's called Acknowledgements. So all kinds of ideas. Those are not ideas that would work, I don't think, in a novel, but for a short story, they're perfect. So again, it's the nature of the idea influencing the type of story that one writes.
And if anyone who's watching, you'd like to sort of promote a writer who's very good at crime short stories, who would you say? They can be contemporary or in the past. Do you have any? Who are the masters of that particular genre?
Well, I think of living writers, Peter Lovesey is absolutely brilliant and has been brilliant for many years as a short story writer. Incredibly versatile, varied, comes up with all kinds of ingenious, sometimes metafictional ideas, as well as more traditional mysteries. So Peter Lovesey, I think, is an absolute master of the craft. A writer, a very good friend of Peter's and mine, who died sadly a few years ago, Reg Hill, with Dion Pascoe. He too was an absolute master of the short story, quite superb. Ruth Rendell also was a really gifted short story writer, and there are many others. The American Edward D. Hope, who wrote nearly 1,000 short stories, wrote practically nothing but short stories. He was a terrific short story writer as well. So there are plenty around, and they are such a joy to read. And of course, it doesn't take long to read them, but they're truly rewarding if well done.
Great. Moving on to another aspect of your career, I've got two of your books here which deal with the golden age of the classic crime period. You're also the consultant to the British Library Crime Fiction Classics as well. How heartening is it to see formerly forgotten authors get a new lease of life? And is there any lesson for contemporary crime writers?
Well, I think this is really one of the issues which has always rather obsessed me, the thought that there are these wonderful books and wonderful writers who disappear from sight. Christie, of course, is an exception to every rule. Dorothy L. Sayers, perhaps, Raymond Chandler. But the overwhelming majority of writers, even those who achieve enormous success, tend to come and go. And people who were bestsellers a few years ago just disappear from sight. And that's always struck me as very unfortunate. So I'm particularly, as you say, associated with Golden Age fiction, but I think this is generally true of crime writing, that it's easy to be forgotten, and I'm determined to do what I can to spread the word about writers I think had something to say, were entertaining storytellers, but have just been lost and deserve to be rediscovered. So the idea of the Golden Age of Murder was to explain why the stories of the 1920s and 1930s had, in my opinion at least, much more to them than critics used to suggest. And I felt that those books were unfairly condemned as being cosy and conventional and not very worthwhile. I've never agreed with that. And so the idea of the Golden Age of Murder was to try to set the record straight as I saw it. It was a book I took 10 years to write because I didn't think anybody would want to publish it. I wasn't sure anybody would want to read it. Because as I mentioned, the Golden Age elements in the Harry Devlin books in the 90s passed by unnoticed to my dismay, really, even though the books did pretty well. So it's about fashion. And somehow or another, I've been lucky in that at long last, the wheel of fashion has turned. And having been resolutely unfashionable in my tastes for so much of my life, in the last few years, there has been this revival of interest in classic crime fiction. And the story of classic crime in 100 books is an attempt to tell the story of the evolution of crime fiction from The Hound of the Baskervilles to Strange on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, 50 years apart, but very, very different books. And I think that's a fascinating period in history. And the British Library invited me to write a couple of introductions to a new series of vintage reprints they were working on they put out 2 or 3 before, which haven't had much of an impact, but they came up with the idea of the vintage cover artwork and having the introductions, and luckily for me and for the library, it just took off from there. So that's become a hugely successful series, which none of us expected, but it's been an absolute joy to be associated with it and to see so many wonderful books coming back. I don't pretend they're all masterpieces, but there's a book called The Spoiled Kill by Mary Kelly, which won a Gold Dagger back in 1961, but completely forgotten. But a really fine crime novel that deserves to be read and enjoyed today, I think. And it's been a great pleasure and a great joy to talk to Mary's widower, who's in his 90s now, and is absolutely overjoyed to see his late wife's work coming back into print. It's a wonderful thing.
Has that been reprinted? Is that out?
Yes, that's now The Spoiled Kill. It's called, and it's a really good book. It deserves to win the Gold Dagger.
Brilliant. And I watch a lot of old crime films, and they always come with a warning now on British TV: may contain outdated attitudes, language, and cultural depictions. I know you don't actually edit the British Library series, but are there any books that just they've had their time? Do you find, or is that not particularly the case with?
I think I speak personally here, not for the British Library. I think that there are books that have had their time, because in any age there are books which range in quality, and there are bad books written in the 20s and 30s, just as I believe there are many very good books, and there are bad books written today, and there'll be bad books written in 10 years' time. It's not about a particular time. Of course, attitudes change, and even the what you might call more progressive writers, and there are a lot of them in the 20s and 30s, a huge number actually. Carrying members of the Communist Party were writing classic detective stories in the 20s and 30s. That's for sure. But even their books contain attitudes that would now not be widely acceptable. I think we just have to recognise that, and as you say, there are TV channels which carry these warnings. I can understand that, but equally, I think that the key is whether it's an author who has, judged by the standards of their time, written a book that's enjoyable and worth reading. That for me is the test. To judge people exclusively by my standards or the standards of our time doesn't seem to me to be quite right.
You mentioned about was it Mary Kelly? If somebody watching now doesn't know much about the Golden Age, has heard of Agatha Christie and perhaps Dorothy Sayers, is there a writer you would recommend to say go and try this one and see how comparable she is to some of the other more famous Golden Age writers?
Yes, I think the writer I would pick out is a writer I talk a lot about in the Golden Age of Murder, a writer called Anthony Barclay. And he also wrote as Francis Isles. And in many ways, I think he was Agatha Christie's favourite detective novelist. And he wrote a wonderful book, which is in the British Library series, called The Poison Chocolates Case, which is a classic whodunit, which has 6 solutions. And then in the 1970s, somebody else, very good writer called Christiana Brown, wrote a 7th solution. And the British Library asked me to write an 8th solution, which is great fun. So that's a book I really love. It's a very cerebral whodunit. It's not a psychological study in character particularly, but as a whodunit, it's fascinating, I think. And Anthony Barclay is a fascinating guy and a fascinating writer. Not all his books were complete successes. But he's always interested, he's always trying to innovate, he's always trying to do something new. And he wrote a book called Before the Fact under the name of Francis Isles, which Hitchcock filmed. But Hitchcock bottled out because the ending of the novel is so dark that Hitchcock felt he couldn't film it. So he put in a happy ending. So the one thing it is not is cosy. It's a very, very dark book indeed. He really was a fascinating and highly influential writer who, as I say, not all his books are complete successes, but they're almost invariably interesting for one reason or another.
That's really interesting. You've been. I don't know if you are still the president of the Detection Club, yeah. And you're a past chair of the Crime Writers Association. You're a member of Murder Squad, which is a group of northern crime writers, aren't they? How important has been sort of creating a network of fellow crime writers as a support network for you as a writer, and as emerging writers as well? How helpful has that been?
I think for me it's been hugely helpful on a personal level, and I think it's a very good thing generally. And I'm very much in favour of these networks. It's a cliche that writing's a solitary business. And I found when I first joined the Crime Writers Association that the experienced, successful writers were very kind to me, very encouraging. Reginald Hill, Robert Barnard, Peter Walker, Peter Lovesey, mentioned earlier. These were all writers that I revered, really. But they were very, very generous towards me, very encouraging, very supportive. Michael Gilbert, Julian Seats, I actually got to know a little bit before they died. And these connections meant a great deal to me, and still do. And I think that this idea of, firstly, encouraging newcomers who feel a bit overawed, a bit nervous, trying to answer any questions they may have, give them a helping hand if possible, is important. I also think that it's easy to forget the writers who've had success but are now finding it a struggle. I think these are individuals who are very often unsung, tend to be neglected. I think that's very unfortunate and not a good thing. I think it's really important for these writers who may feel that, at one time I was the flavour of the month and now I'm not. That's a sad state of affairs, and I think that any support that can be given to those individuals to encourage them, to help them along, is really, really valuable. And because writers do lose heart. I've known many writers personally whom I've greatly admired who've given up. And I think that's very sad. And I think that anything that can be done to encourage people to write, to encourage people to keep writing, is highly, highly desirable. I'm all in favour of it.
You mentioned Reginald Hill and Peter Lovesey. Are those, would you consider sort of that those group of people at that stage in your career to have been your main mentors in terms of writing?
Yes. And Reg Hill, who's the wittiest person I've ever met in any walk of life, was a wonderful guy. I had many conversations with him over the years, and he was very encouraging. He was a demanding author of himself. He was demanding of others, but the encouragement he gave me, because he wasn't somebody who flattered. He always told it as it was, and that was really valuable. And I treasure the memory of the conversations I had with Reg. I admired him and his writing enormously. I still do.
Yeah, his wit comes across in his books, doesn't it? Yeah, definitely.
Very, very clever witty guy.
Yeah, was he? So in terms of your fiction, you've written police procedurals, you've written PI style books with Harry Devlin, you've written historical fiction. And of course you've got your short stories, you've got your non-fiction. Is there a genre that you haven't written in, that in the back of your mind, like, for example, one day I'd like to write a ghost story or something?
Well, I've written one or two. I've written a ghost story in short story form, and as I mentioned earlier, the short story is a great form to experiment with.
Yeah.
So I've done a futuristic story and horror stories as well a few times. But I think crime, as I say, became my passion as a reader and as a would-be writer at a very early age, and it remains my central passion as a writer. So trying different things within the crime genre is something I'm always very, very interested in. And one of the big advantages I've had in my life is that having worked as a lawyer for all these years, and I'm still, although very, very part-time, I'm still a lawyer, that has at least given me a separate income stream. It's important. And it's enabled me to write books that I believe in, that I care about. And that's what I've always tried to do, to not to write for the moment, for the fashion, but to write books that I felt had something about them. And that's what I hope to continue to do, in whatever form and whatever type of crime fiction, to write books that I believe in, because that to me is the key to enjoying your life as a writer, and that's something I've absolutely loved it, I must say.
The crime genre is huge now, isn't it? It seems to have expanded in terms of what comes into the crime genre. You mentioned that you'd finished. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the writer. You'd finished a book that somebody had started. Yeah, and obviously there's quite a few writers now who are writing. Sophie Hannah with the Poirot books and so on. Is there any particular writer, if you had to choose a writer that you would continue their work, who would that be?
I've toyed with it a few times. I've had a few approaches, and it would have to be someone where I was confident I could get into the style, the mindset. And I don't have any fixed preferences. I've looked at a number of suggestions since writing the Bill Knox book, and it's never been quite right. But maybe one day it's something I would have a go at, because I think as in terms of one's professionalism as a writer, it's an interesting exercise, apart from anything else, to write well, Bill Knox, that was a completion novel, but also the continuation novels. I'm not averse to them, as long as they are well done. That's always the key. Whatever one's writing, you've got to do it as well as you possibly can.
Very good. We've got 10 minutes left, Martin, and I think we'll have some questions shortly. But can you tell us a little bit about what you are doing next? I hesitate to ask because it could be fiction, non-fiction, short stories. What we didn't mention How Done It. Do you want to say a little bit about that, because that is the latest book?
Yes. Well, How Done It is a book produced by members of the Detection Club, past and present. As you said, I've been the president of the club since 2015, and it's the oldest social network. We're talking about social networks. The oldest social network of crime writers in the world. It was founded by Anthony Barclay, I mentioned, and the founder members included G.K. Chesterton, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, A.A. Milne, the Winnie the Pooh author, who also wrote detective fiction, amongst many others. So that's essentially a small dining club. It's been going for 90 years, and it's produced a number of books over the years. Some of them very successful, and the royalties have helped to keep the club going. So I proposed a couple of years ago that we write a book about the craft of crime writing, and include a few snippets from past members. And that was well received. I envisaged a book with about 15 or 20 essays. And to my amazement and delight and glee, pretty much every living member of the club agreed to contribute without payment, all for the funds of the club. Nobody took a penny. None of the estates of the deceased writers took a penny. It was all for the benefit of the club. And this book, which is a massive book, it's 500 pages now, because there are 90 contributors for me, feature. It covers the whole gamut of writing technique, but also the writing life. So you have Stella Duffy talking about how to improvise. You have Liza Cody talking about female perspective, feminist perspective on crime writing. You have writers talking about how to deal with writer's block, how to deal with the adaptation of your work for TV, for radio, for film, and that kind of thing. So it's a very, very wide-ranging book. Ian Rankin talks about why crime fiction is good for you. Val McDermid talks about the importance of story. Sophie Hannah talks about plotting and optimal subterfuge. huge. Anne Cleves talked about landscape. There's a piece by P.D. James about setting, and so on and so on. So it's a very varied, it's a very eclectic book. I never expected it to be so substantial, but I've been thrilled by the reaction, and it's featured in a couple of best books of the year list in the last week or two. So that's been great in the national press. It's been published in the States, and it's selling extremely well, I was told yesterday, out there. So that's been a book that was a labour of love, and it was a great joy to receive all these manuscripts from all over the place, from such a wonderful group of writers who wanted to support the detection club.
And what about yourself, Martin? What are you actually writing next?
Well, I've completed a new Lake District mystery called The Crooked Shore, which will be published hopefully sometime next year.
Crooked Shore, great title, actually.
The Crooked Shore is the 8th of the Lake District mysteries. As I mentioned, I've started the 3rd book about Rachel Savanay, the successor to Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall, and I'm as well as the British Library books in various anthologies. I'm also working on a book about the history of crime fiction, which has been keeping me out of mischief for a number of years now, and I hope will eventually see the light of day, and that'll be quite a chunky book because of the extensive nature of the subject.
And will that go way before Golden Age? It will go right back to the origins of the genre
and worldwide.
Oh, that's wow!
It will. It's an ambitious, perhaps foolishly ambitious project, but it's one I'm very attached to, and it's one I've put an awful lot of time into. Not least this year during the lockdown. So I'm really excited about it, and I've consulted a lot of people about it, and I've been very thrilled with their feedback on the work in progress. So I've got my fingers crossed.
That's great. We've only got about 7 minutes left. So I don't know if I heard the questions were going to come up on the screen, but I can also see them as well. This one is from Jill Hart, who's watching, and she's in Lincoln. She's associated with Linden Books in Lincoln, actually. Jill, hello, Jill.
Hello.
Which past crime writers would be your ideal dinner party guests? What a question!
Well, I would probably say that Dorothy L. Sayers would be high on the list. She was, I think, a famously blunt, not to mention rude person sometimes, but she was very intelligent, very interesting woman who had a very complex personal life, which I think influenced the way that she behaved in public. She had her secrets, but I think she was a very strong-minded woman. She wouldn't like to be called a feminist, but she certainly was, I think, in reality. And I think I'd find her a fascinating person to talk to. I'm a great admirer of Dorothy L. Sayers. I accept that there are flaws in pretty much all of the books, but that's true. Books generally, isn't it? But there are also wonderful things in all of them. And she was a really interesting writer who did a lot to elevate the detective story. She was ambitious for the detective story format, and I like that idea of ambition. I think she'd be a fascinating, if perhaps slightly challenging dinner guest, companion around the dinner table, because she certainly used to hold court at the detection club, and yeah, she certainly did, yeah.
In your introductory video, actually, there was a photo of her, which I hadn't seen, a really young photo, and she looked completely different to how I imagined her, actually.
Yeah, she was a formidable woman. I think had a troubled private life and many misfortunes in it. And I think that sometimes she's judged rather harshly. But I think that once you know her personal circumstances, you ought to temper those judgments with a lot of sympathy for what she went through over the years. She had a child, an illegitimate child, and never acknowledged his existence, although she cared for him in many ways. It was a secret, and it remained a secret for her entire life. Nobody knew apart from a couple of close relatives. Yeah. And that kind of thing going on is is hard to imagine, really.
Yeah, I think of the non-Christie golden age. I think Peter Wimsey is my favourite detective. I would say I absolutely love him.
Good character, yeah, and one who changed. And of course, the great thing about those books is the later books, when he meets Harriet Vane, that's really the first case of a detective evolving as a character. Sherlock Holmes never evolves, and Edward Poirot never evolves, and Miss Marple never evolves, but Wimsey and Harriet do evolve, and that really set the template for modern crime writers, where of course characters do evolve and age and have their relationships and so on. So it was highly influential.
Yeah. We've got another question from Manjiri. Did you ever feel that you were repeating yourself in your plots and mysteries? And what did you do to make your plot different from the first one? I suppose we all have our preoccupations, don't we?
Yeah,
did you ever feel that you're repeating yourself?
I think that even within a series, I'm a great believer in trying to keep it fresh and varied. Actually, speaking of Reg Hill, as we were, that was one of the things he was a very strong believer in. He used to alternate between the series and non-series.
Yeah.
And he and I did talk about this quite a lot. I've always tried to write each book in the series a little different, and to keep my own interest engaged rather than just doing the same old with each instalment in the series. And the Dungeon House, which is the most recent Lake District book, that's quite different from the previous ones and the previous books in the series. And the new book, The Crooked Shore, is different again in a number of ways. And doing that, and I'd had a gap of 5 or 6 years between writing The Dungeon House and The Crooked Shore. I came back to it fresh. I really wanted to find out what Hannah and Daniel were getting up to, and I had a whole series of fresh ideas. So I tend to look to write differently. Mortmain Hall is a very different book from Gallows Court, even though it features the same protagonists, and the next book will be different again. So I do think that that's desirable. You have to hope that your readers will come with you. You'll carry them along, but you're not giving them precisely what you've given them in the last book. But I think readers like that. They like to be kept on their toes, as long as you don't go completely off piste, so to speak. So I think that's what keeps me excited about that. And it is important, as you know, Sarah. It's hard work sometimes, isn't it? It's very hard work, and the words don't flow the way you dreamed they would flow. And so you need something to keep your morale, to keep your faith, keeping that belief in what you write is really so very important. And writing something a little bit different from what you've done before is the ideal way to achieve that, to keep yourself interested is a huge benefit, I think.
Well, Martin, thank you ever so much for that. We've got 1 minute left. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear you right from the age of 8 and your love of crime fiction developing all the way through to your working as a lawyer, because you were working professionally as a lawyer all the way through the vast majority of your career, as well as writing, and all the help you've given, including myself actually, to emerging crime writers. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you, and I'm sorry we're not in India talking, but we're in rainy England. But it's been great to talk. Thank you ever so much.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks also again to those tuning in, and also to the wonderful people in Nigeria and all her team who worked so very hard in very testing circumstances to bring this festival to life in a different way. And that's been really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this interesting and engaging session. We're so sure our audience had a wonderful experience. Please join us after a short break for our next session. Yours truly, Scott Iman, at 9:15 p.m. Thank you.